We are recording the interview of William Ralph Short. This interview has been being conducted by Jeremy Tack and Jeremy Dobbins from the Wright State University's Veteran Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University in the Veterans and Military Center. It is 10:30 a.m. on the 31st of May, 2018. William, thank you so much, or Bill, like we call him, right? Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Let's start off with where and when were you born?
Cincinnati, Ohio, 1947.
Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
Wilford Kendall Short, he was an engineer, worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for FTD, Foreign Technology Development. My mother was a housewife, Verena C. Potts. Both were born in two small towns in southern Ohio, West Union and Winchester.
Do you have any siblings?
Brother and a sister.
Have any of your family members, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents served in the military?
All the way back to the Revolutionary War.
Really?
That's why we're in Ohio. I actually came here to photograph these two towns where my parents grew up, and I photographed James David Short's grave. He was a corporal in the Union Army during the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
But my family ended up in Ohio because Ohio was land grant granted for veterans of the Revolutionary War. So they lived in Virginia, which is now West Virginia, and they walked overland to Wheeling and then built rafts and floated down to Ripley, Ohio. Then hiked inland and grabbed their 50 acres and became tobacco farmers.
Huh.
And ever since then, I have cousins who fought in the War of 1812. My James David fought in the Civil War. I have another cousin who fought in the Philippines during the 1890s. World War II, Korea, World War I, and me, Vietnam.
All right, so you joined the Army, correct?
I was drafted.
Drafted.
Yeah.
Before you were drafted, what were you doing?
I was a student at Ohio University, and I wasn't a very good student, so I dropped out for a semester. I was kind of lost. I started in 1965, and I didn't really understand or know what I wanted to be. My dad being an engineer, he pushed me into something like engineering. I was always good in math, so I started out as a mathematics major, but quickly realized that my heart wasn't in it. So after a year and a half, I dropped out, and then during that period of time, I lost my student deferment, and I was drafted in March of 1968. Drafted out of local board number 13, Clark County, Springfield.
And so what were your thoughts and feelings when you got your notification of being drafted?
Well, I wasn't a great supporter of the war, but I also didn't really know very much about it. And I wasn't about to go to Canada at that point, like some guys were thinking about doing. This is 68, so there was an anti-war movement, but I wasn't that terribly aware of it. I knew that there was a little bit of it going on, but for me, since with my family history and knowing my family history and my dad working at Wright-Patterson, he was a Democrat, but he was very much somebody who believed in service to country. He really believed in Kennedy's words of "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." So there's no question in my mind that if I got drafted and I was called up, I was going to go. So I went, thinking that, well, I got a year and a half of college. Maybe I won't end up in the infantry and end up in Vietnam. Maybe I'll end up as a clerk typist in Germany, and I'll get to see some of the world. So what I didn't realize is that because I got drafted in March of 68, TET of 68 had happened in February, and the draft numbers jumped from something like 15 in my county up to about 150 the following month, because TET was such a fiasco for wasn't necessarily a military defeat, but it was a psychological defeat for the U.S. military. So they upped the level of draftees significantly. I figured that I would just go in and see what it was all about, and what, as it turned out, rather than being a clerk typist, because they needed more bodies in the field, they needed people like me who scored high on the tests that they give you when you come in, that they had all basically from the beginning probably planned to put me in the infantry. And that's exactly what they did. I went through basic training at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. And then I was assigned at the end of basic, I was assigned to an advanced infantry training unit at Fort Jackson. And then at the end of that, they offered me non-commissioned officers candidate school. And I thought, well, I'd rather go over with some rank if I'm going to go, and then, also I get to stay in the States for another 13 weeks and postpone deployment to Vietnam, because once you're in the infantry at that point in time, you knew exactly where you're going to go. You're not going to Korea. You're not going to go to Germany. You're going straight to Vietnam. So I went to Fort Benning. I was there for 13 weeks. And then from there, I got assigned to a basic training unit at Fort Lewis, Washington. And the idea was that they would take these young sergeants who had never done any command at all and put them in a basic training unit as what we called turtle hats. DIs, real DIs have the Smokey the Bear hats, and they go to DI school and all that, but I didn't do that. I was just kind of like an assistant. So I wore the helmet liners. You guys don't wear these now, but the steel pot that you used to wear had a fiberglass helmet liner that went under it. And the assistant DIs would wear those instead of the Smokey the Bear hats. And we always nicknamed them turtle heads because they looked like a turtle shell. So I was a turtle hat at Fort Lewis for one period of basic training, and then I got orders to go to Vietnam. And I went to Vietnam in February of 1969.
So joining the military, was there, going to basic training or boot camp, tell me what that was like. Was that a change for you?
Yeah, it was dramatic. As you guys know, it's kind of like going to hell. It wasn't the Marines, but it was definitely, was not an easy walk. I'll tell you, give you an example of some of the things that happened. We're going to have an inspection, and I needed a haircut, and so there was a small, kind of like a PX, but not a full PX. It's kind of like a snack shack where you can go get a pizza or something. So a friend and I, because we both needed haircuts, and we don't want to get gigged for haircuts the next day, so we bailed on going to chow that night and went to this snack shack to get a pizza. They also served beer there. Well, it turned out right after we left, there was a fight that broke out. Somebody got knifed. And so they brought out the whole company and stood us all at the position of attention in the company streets. And Fort Jackson, the barracks were built on stilts. So there was about as high as this table, maybe a little lower. And we still do low crawl under the barracks. And so what they did is they wanted to know who had gone to this snack shack. So they dropped us all in the dying cockroach. You guys know what the dying cockroach is? You lay on your back with your hands and feet up in the air like this, and you lay there long enough that you start to kind of droop. You end up looking like a dying cockroach. So all the shitbirds, that's what we were. All the shitbirds were called out into the company street. We're all dropped to the dying cockroach position. And they harassed us for, I don't know, it seemed like forever. So finally, I just got up and said, yeah, okay. I was one of the guys who went there. Two other guys, they said, yeah, we went there too. And so they let the rest of the company go. And so we were told to dig a 6x6x6. So in the company area, they gave us an entrenching tool. And the three of us spent all night digging a hole 6 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 6 feet deep. I went into Sergeant Bullock, who was the first sergeant. It's a part Cherokee Indian. One of the meanest motherfuckers ever. I went in and told him that my hole was done. He came out, looked at it, threw a cigarette butt in there and said, fill it. So then I filled it, and then I went back and told him I filled it, and I explained to him that I had only gone there to do the haircut. I wasn't involved in the fight or anything. And he just sent me on my way. So it just so happened that day we were doing the PT test. And the PT test was 500 possible points. And I was much smaller and more spry than I am now at 70 years old. And so I scored 489 on the test. The only thing I couldn't do, I ran a 6:11 mile in combat boots. And you had to run a 6 flat to get a perfect score. But that low crawl thing that they made us do under the barracks was something we did all the time. And that kind of harassment, like in your face yelling, "Could you think you could kill somebody?" And on and on and on. So, and then we doubled when I was in NCOC school. All our TACs and drill sergeants were Rangers, and so we double timed everywhere. And we double timed. We were full pack and M16 the whole time, every place we went.
So when you got orders to Vietnam, what were your thoughts then?
Oh God. Well, I didn't want to go. I didn't really think that. I really think that I had no factual information about why the war shouldn't be fought, but there was enough chatter and talk that the kind of feeling that the war was bullshit was kind of a general kind of attitude, but all of us felt like we were kind of stuck and we had to go. So, I went home on leave, and I wasn't going to go to. I still, I thought about it, but no way I was going to go to Canada or desert, like some guys were starting to do at that time. And I thought, okay, I'll go. If I really am opposed to what's going on there, I'll figure out what to do when I get there, and maybe there's something I can do that will, that'll justify why I'm going. So when I'd only seen my dad cry twice in his life, and once was when his father died, and the other time was when I got on the plane to go. And that was pretty moving, because my dad was like kind of a very cold person. He worked with Air Force intelligence, so he was very he's wound tight, kept to himself a lot. So I got on the plane and went to San Francisco to deploy. And when I got there, I flew civilian to there in uniform, because you could fly for free if you were in uniform. And I got there a day early. And I went to this cheap hotel. It was like $6 a night to stay in this hotel. It's a real flea bag. Because I was still trying to figure out what I was going to do. I was like this close to maybe bailing and going to Canada. And I remember getting up the next morning, and I was walking toward the base to report, and I passed this church. And I went into the church, and I wasn't particularly religious myself, but my mother's father was a minister, and her 7 brothers were ministers, so there was a lot of religion in my family as well. And even though we didn't go to church as a family on a regular basis, and I wasn't really kind of agnostic at the time, I didn't know what else to do. So I went into the church and just sat there, I don't know, for an hour maybe, just trying to piece things together and figure out what I was doing. Then finally, there were like 3 crosses, and finally I got up and I took my dog tags off, and I walked over. I remember thinking about this very clearly, that superstitiously I wasn't going to hang my dog tags on the highest cross, because that was Christ's cross. So I hung it on the lowest cross and left my dog tags there. And I reported right after that. I left my dog tags hanging on this cross in San Francisco. And then we were there for, I think, overnight, and then flew out the next day. A lot of civilian planes, carriers, flew troops to Vietnam, because they used to take them by boat, but then there were so many people going. At the time I was going, they were flying guys there all the time. And I flew in Braniff Airways. You guys don't know what Braniff is, but Braniff planes were painted Day-Glo orange, Day-Glo green, and Day-Glo yellow. Bright neon colors. So here I'm flying to Vietnam in this brightly painted plane that I forget if it was orange or yellow, but it was one of those 2 colors. And I'm thinking, I'm flying to a war zone in a plane that is like almost like a flashing neon sign saying, "Here come more troops." So So we flew to Alaska, then to Tokyo, and then to Vietnam. And I remember as we landed, the pilot said that it was going to be kind of an abrupt landing. And it was all GIs. We were all in combat fatigues and all in jungle fatigues. He said it was going to be a little bit of a rough landing because they were taking some fire from some ground fire. So when we got down, that was disconcerting. But then we got down and we walked out. And I think anybody who's been to Vietnam will tell you this: the minute you hit the doorway, it just feels like somebody took one of those green army blankets and had soaked it in hot water and then just thrown it over your head. It was suffocating.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we were riding by bus to the deployment post to get our assignment, because we weren't assigned to any units then at that time, you'd had to do 3 days of orientation, and during that time they would decide where they were going to send you, and then they would assign you to a unit, and then fly you out to that unit. So as we were traveling, I remember, and I still smell this from time to time, the smell of diesel. And that's something that just never goes away because everything is diesel. And when I smell diesel, it sometimes triggers me back to Vietnam. But I remember that smell. I remember a rotting smell, like rotting vegetables. Mm-hmm. Just this really strong, pungent smell. And then the people all look strange to me because I grew up in, a very white, very, very insular kind of community where there were only, I think there was like one Asian person in my high school, 2 African Americans, and maybe 1 Jewish person. So it was not, I was not worldly about other kinds of people at all. Mm. Not until I actually got in the Army. Then I met a lot more blacks and Hispanics. But I just remember everything looking so strange, and the colors being so vivid and so saturated, and it was just overpowering. Sensory, it was just completely overpowering. And then we got to this deployment base, and they had to. They weren't just going to let you sit around. Like what they did is you had to get reoriented with your weaponry. Like I came right out of non-commissioned officer candidate school, and I had qualified with the M16, with the M60. I shot expert with all of those. Shot expert with the 50 caliber machine gun. Fired a 90 millimeter recoilless. Had thrown grenades in practice. Fired an M79 grenade launcher. I was weaponed out my ass. I knew all those weapons backwards and forwards. So, but there are a lot of guys who are going to be clerk typists, so they wanted to reorient them because they'd gone through other kinds of AIT training, so they wanted to reorient everybody to the tools of their trade. So that was part of what you did. And to back up a little bit, what they would do is they would assign you a job. Since I was an NCO, they weren't going to give me like a detail, like police detail or anything like that. Policing not being, for those of you who don't know what military policing is, it wasn't like being an MP. It's like picking up cigarette butts off the ground. So what they did is they assigned me to this garbage truck. So they gave me a .45 and told me to ride shotgun on this garbage truck that was coming into the base to collect garbage from the mess halls. And so I'm sitting in this Vietnamese garbage truck with this Vietnamese owner who's dressed very neatly in a white shirt, and he kept offering me, Marlboro cigarettes. He's very proud of the fact that he could afford to buy American cigarettes. Mm-hmm. And there were these 3 guys in the back that were basically in their underwear and knee deep in garbage with these plastic bags tied to their waists. And so we went from and my job was to make sure that they didn't steal anything or that they weren't saboteurs. So that's why they armed me, and I was basically escorting them through the base. So we went from mess hall to mess hall, and the garbage get thrown in the back. And this guy in the front was really nice and really pleasant, and offered me these cigarettes, and very proud of the fact that he could speak a little English, and he was a businessman, and he kept yelling at the guys in the back, and the guys in the back were all like kowtowing to him, and being very submissive. And I kept wondering what the plastic bags were for. And then I realized that what they were doing is they were taking food that had been, like chicken or whatever, hadn't been eaten or half eaten. They were stuffing it in the bags and taking it home. And that kind of poverty I had never experienced. My family is all from Southern Ohio, which is working class farms, and they weren't wealthy people by any means. They were real struggling working class people, but I had never seen that kind of poverty before. And that just completely blew me away. And that was one of the first things that I started thinking, there's something wrong with this picture. And then we were doing weapons training to get realigned with shooting our weapons. We were working with M79s one day, and the sergeants who were running everything were guys who had gotten off the field, and they'd already been in combat, and they were just getting ready to deploy back to the States for whatever reason. Maybe they're minorly wounded, or they just had served enough time that they got released. So they were running us through things like, how do you set up an ambush, which is all like textbook stuff to me. And so we were getting reacquainted with M79s and requalifying with M79s, and we were shooting at these monuments, and I realized that it was a Buddhist cemetery. And so we're like shooting off these thump, thump, thump rounds to shoot these headstones, and I'm thinking, on Memorial Day, every day of my life growing up, I went to the cemetery to honor the dead who fought in all the wars that we had been in before. And here I am blowing up monuments in another country where people would go to honor their dead. And I thought, man, this is just wrong. And so I kept missing, not wanting to hit one of the tombstones. And his sergeant said, what the fuck? You should be able to hit that target. And I just basically explained to him that I wasn't going to blow it up. I wasn't going to shoot that target. And then he just muttered something and let me go. So then once I went through that, then they assigned me the 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry, 1st Infantry Division. And so those kinds of things started, like the seeds have been planted before. I always thought that there was something wrong with this picture, but I didn't have the facts. And now when I started seeing these kind of things, I thought, aren't we supposed to be here to help these people? Aren't we the good guys? Aren't we the ones who are supposed to be, honoring their democracy? And here I saw, like we're basically treating them like shit. We're desecrating their cemeteries. In one night, in one of the mess halls, they had lots of Vietnamese women working, serving the tables and stuff. And, it was, lots of guys were like, gook this, gook that, and then I remember sitting at this table and somebody said something about number 10. And the woman who was waiting the tables slammed the tray down and just started yelling at us. And I realized that later on, this number 10 was like something you called the Vietnamese when they did something bad or they were bad. Number 10 was the worst. And so that and then those guys started getting off, ragging on her, and it just didn't seem, picture just didn't seem right. So then when I got to my unit, they were really undermanned, and the guy who was actually the platoon sergeant or the platoon leader was a sergeant, because they had been in some combat earlier and been reduced in numbers, and my platoon ranged anywhere on the low side of 14 to the high side of 25, 26. So this sergeant was the first one who introduced me to the platoon. Then we got an LT, and he came in, and you know, ran things after that. And I was assigned as a squad leader right away because I was a sergeant, but, you know, I was green. I had no clue what I was doing. The first firefight we were in was like what our operation was. We were in the Michelin Rubber Plantation outside of Lai Khe, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail came down through Laos and Cambodia, and it came in through the area where we were working. So all the supplies that came from the north filtered into the south through these different areas, and our job was to stop that infiltration. And so we would do search and destroy during the day as a company, and then divide up into platoon-sized ambushes at night, and then rejoin as a company during the day. And we were an air mobile unit, so we would fly out by chopper. The first aircraft flew us. We'd fly out by chopper and be dropped in the jungle, and we'd walk for 3 to 5 days on operations, and then fly back into what we called NDPs, night defensive positions, that were fire bases out in the middle of the jungle. There would be a cleared area out around the NDP, and then be a ring of bunkers that would be alternated like this, and none of the firing ports were out to the front, they were all to the sides, so you covered the different sides, different angles. So what your field of view was your buddy's bunker over here rather than your bunker. So you had to rely on your two bunkers on either side of you to fire at anybody on a ground attack coming in toward you. So we would get back to those areas, which would have either a 4-deuce mortar platoon there, firing support, or they might be in 105 howitzers that would be their firing support. And when you get back, you get a shower. You don't shower in the field, but when you get back, you get a shower, get a hot meal, then you resupply, get new ammunition, and then you head back out for more operations. So the first operation we went on was in one of the rubber tree plantations, and the rubber trees grow in rows like corn, but they're spaced about 15 feet, maybe 20 feet apart. So it's like this grid of rubber trees. So you have a big field of fire, but your fire is interrupted because there's lots of trees. So when you look off to the left or the right, you have a good field of fire, but there's, you know, like trees like this. So in M16s, the round is so small that it deflects off those trees pretty easily, where an AK is a 7.62 round that's heavier, and it can cut through smaller brush and that sort of thing. But the first time we went out, we made contact in this rubber forest, and I always worried about what I would do when I made that first contact, whether I would actually fire or freeze. And something just, I don't even remember the whole firefight. I don't remember any of it except getting hit on the head with a rock. And that was the guy who was next to me, who was about maybe as far as from here to the end of the table. And the reason he threw the rock was he was trying to get me to stop firing. So I carried 21 magazines because I was 21. I was really superstitious. And we had 20-round clip magazines. And I only put 19 rounds in it because M16s had a tendency to jam if you had too many rounds. So I had 21 magazines, 19 rounds in each one. And I had fired seven magazines before I even knew what happened. And the only way I got stopped was that guy throwing the rock. So how we determined whether we were successful or not was by body count. And I always avoided, like other guys were always curious enough that there was always people who could go out and count the bodies. And I always, for some reason, just avoided. I just didn't want to do it. Maybe I think, in retrospect, maybe I was a little bit in denial that I didn't. I always thought like I was part of a firing squad. There's only one live round in the firing squad, so nobody really knows who's actually killing the person they're executing. And that's kind of the way I thought was like, I'm there fighting with all these other guys, and I don't know if I'm the one who killed that person. So that kind of whitewashed things for me. So just about every time we went on patrol, we made contact. And, that would be like 2-3 days in, 3-5 days out, and just keep rotating back and forth like that. And sometimes we'd ambush on rivers, sometimes we ambush on trails. We'd set up our ambushes right before dusk because it's so hot and humid that that the VC or the NVA didn't move a lot during the day. They moved mainly early in the morning or late evening when it was cooler. And these Kit Carson scouts we had would help us find trails, and they'd give us an idea of how many people had traveled the trails. And so we'd set up. Each platoon has 2 M60 gunners. So what we would do is we'd set up the guns here on the trail. The CP gaggle would be here. That's the command unit. Then there'd be 2 rear deployments back here. And when I was a squad leader, I would be mainly back in the back area with maybe my squad would be one of those squads in the back, because the gun squads would be up here. I wasn't one of the gun squads, I was a rifle squad. And then when I was platoon sergeant, I would sit with the gun squad up here because I was the one who was supposed to sort of direct fire. So we'd set out claymores and then put the 2 guns here and then wait for somebody to walk through. Then first we'd blow the claymores and open up with M60s. And then once we got a suppression of fire, and we'd initially with our M16s open up on automatic, but then very quickly switch to a semi, because you just want to suppress the fire and take control of the fire, then follow up with semi-automatic fire so you conserve rounds. Because even if you have 21 magazines, that one firefight I was in, I blew through a third of my magazines in just 30 seconds. So you could always get choppers to drop more ammo in, but if you ran out, it could take the choppers 30 minutes to get there, and you're up shit creek if you ran out of ammo. So you have to try to conserve it a little bit. So typically if we blew an ambush, which everybody thought sucked, because then we'd have to get up and leave, because you never stay when you blow an ambush because you've alerted everybody where you were. So then you go off and set up another ambush somewhere. So, and then crazy shit happened, silly stuff that seems funny now. But we blew an ambush once, and all we could find were body parts. We didn't find a full body, and there were drag marks. So it was kind of assumed that people were drug their comrades away, or they crawled away, or whatever. And you get really superstitious. Like my camouflage cover, I still have it today, was covered with numbers, zip code, phone numbers, birthdays. Even these Cambodians did these kind of fancy prayer scrolls on my helmet, because you get superstitious really bad. And so we left and set up another night position. We don't ambush then. After we did ambush, we just set up in a defensive position, because we figure that we have to be on the defensive. We're not on the offensive anymore, because we've already announced that we're there. As if they didn't know anyway, because we're like carrying 60 pounds of equipment stumbling through the jungle, and they're like light-footed, and it's their backyard, and it's like somebody. I don't know where you guys grew up, but it's like if I grew up, I lived in Enon. It's like if somebody invaded my town, because I grew up there, I knew every nook and cranny, because I had slept out and run around the neighborhood with tomato fights with my friends and stuff. So that's the way the Vietnamese were. They knew that area. It was their home. So we would just gaggle up and just sit through the night, hoping that we wouldn't make any more contact. But you get really superstitious. So we're sitting there, and we heard this kind of stomping around out in front of us. And I remember that these two guys were sitting with one of the M60s, and I was sitting with them. And then we hear this stomping out in front of us, and this brush breaking and cracking. And we're, like getting ready, thinking that there's enemy troops moving out there. Then all of a sudden we hear this like scream, like we'd never heard before. Just this like high-pitched wail that I had never heard anything like that before. And then we heard the clomping coming even faster. And I remember the gunner, he's got an M60, right? What does he do? He grabs his 45 and it's like this, and this cat comes running up and jumps right over top of us. And he's just like shaking like this, didn't fire or anything, but it was some cat in the jungle that just let out this scream. And everybody, when we heard the clomping, like two of these guys said, it's the ghosts of the guys we just shot. It's like you get really weird and superstitious. So, and it wasn't drugs. Like we did plenty of drugs when we were back in the NDP, but you're out in the field, you don't, if somebody even thought about doing drugs, you're like, everybody, that's a no-no. But if you're back in the NDP, sure, you drink a warm Budweiser and smoke a joint, absolutely. And then, crazy stuff like that would happen. One time we were on a ridge, and we looked over at the other ridge, and we stopped movement because we saw a unit moving on the other ridge, and it was being led by a woman. It was a VC unit being led by a woman, and there was this kind of urban legend that if you ran into a unit that was led by a woman, that you didn't want to make contact with them because they would fight harder, because they were being led by this woman. And actually, we actually interviewed, when we went on our trips back to Vietnam, we interviewed a woman who was part of an all-combat women's unit. So a complete infantry unit that was led by women and was all women. So the rumor was that they would fight more tenaciously because this woman was definitely hardcore, and the soldiers would not want to falter under the eyes of a female. So we just sat down, just watched them walk away. We didn't engage them at all. So, but the turning point was a firefight we got into where we sat down for lunch. And I remember my RTO, my radio telephone operator, decided for some reason, we usually didn't put our claymores out when we sat down for lunch because we were still moving. And he decided that he didn't have a good feeling about where we stopped. And so he decided, well, I'm going to put my claymore out. So he walked out about 30 yards and set up his claymore. And I told him, I said, you're wasting your time. This is like kind of crazy. He went ahead and did it. And as we're eating, we heard a noise coming from that direction. And he turned around and squeezed the detonator and fired his claymore. Then we started taking fire. And we got into this firefight. And like our packs are off and we're kind of lounging around. All of a sudden we're in this big firefight. And then after it was over, this is one of the times when I did go out to check the bodies. And there was an E6 who had been assigned to our unit, an African American guy that I was kind of tight with. And he's introduced me to booby trapping. And so what we would do is we'd take fragmentation grenade and we pull I forget if it's the primary or secondary pin, but I forget what it is, but we pull the ring, the lever's still on it. We lay the lever under the rib cage here where it curves, and then roll the body over. And then the grenade would sit there on that pin. And what he had said, we didn't do it this time, but what he had done in the past, what he claimed he had done, was replace the detonator with a shorter fuse And I don't know exactly where he got the fuse. It might have been from a smoke round or something. I don't know if they're actually compatible, but he claimed that that's what he did. He wanted the detonation to go off a little faster. But these grenades were like just standard grenades. So we started booby trapping bodies. And then, you end up doing that, and then you go off and you're off in the, after people in ambush, you go off and you're sitting there and you hear the grenade go off. And then, and then I started, once I started seeing people, like I remember the first body I booby trapped, the guy was an older guy. He's a little heavy set, not fat, but a little thick, like a real stocky farmer type. And I remember when I walked up to him, he was in a small indentation, and his hand was up on top of a berm, and his finger was half ripped off, and the bone was sticking out of his thumb. And I just remember staring at that bone, and it just kind of like became almost like radioactive. It just excuse me. This is really not the first time I've told this story, but I get tripped up sometimes. But I just remember that it just seemed to glow, and that stuck with me. And after that, I really started to think, what the fuck are you doing? Because then I could no longer say that I was just part of a group. Then I had to actually admit to myself that I was actually killing people. And that was pretty hard to take, especially since I didn't really know why we were there. I didn't think we were there for any good reason. And then we're on another operation where I was walking with the first squad, and we were walking point, and I was about the second or third man back from point, and my RTO was behind me, and I heard a clink, and it's you get real tuned to sounds, and you recognize sounds like almost immediately, and we carried metal canteens in basic, and I knew the Vietnamese used a lot of American equipment, especially old equipment, because they got it from the ARVNs, the Southern Army, because we gave the Southern Army lots of old equipment. And I knew it was an American canteen. The cap on the canteen had slung down and hit the canteen, and it had this kind of hollow clink because the canteen wasn't completely full of water. So I called back and I stopped the company, and I told the captain that I think we had movement on our flank. And so he said, take some guys out. So I took 3 guys out to check it out. And we found a bunker. It was like basically like a hole in the ground. It was about like this big. And we're looking at it. And then one of the guys that I was with reaches up into this tree and says, hey, Sarge, there's a toothbrush up here. He says, Jesus Christ, it's still wet. And at that point, this guy pops up out of the hole. And he had an M16. Not an AK, and he just opened up on all 4 of us and missed every one of us. I don't know if he was, it was happening so quickly. He might have been firing high and just missed us, but we all hit the deck. And right before that, I'd called my captain. I said, we have a bunker here, I want to frag it. And he said, no, don't frag it, because we aren't set up yet. We don't want to announce that we're here. He said, just look it over. And that's when this guy I remember their names, but I won't say the names. That's when he said the toothbrush was wet, and that's when the guy popped up and fired at us. And then, we set up camp there and called in tunnel rats, and they went through and cleaned out the tunnel and found a big cache, and never got the guy. He went through another tunnel. But that, coming that close, like I was as close to that guy who shot at me as I am to you. And coming that close and then booby trapping bodies, it just seemed insane to me. And that's when we started talking about, what are we going to do? Mm-hmm. And my first squad leader was another NCOC graduate like me, and he had a degree in animal husbandry from, I think, Michigan State. And so we thought, well, maybe we could become part of the U.S. pacification program and get off out of combat and work with units that actually go into villages and do what we thought were kind of like Peace Corps work. We didn't realize it was actually kind of a carrot and stick thing where they would go in and offer support to a local village, but only if that local village would rat out all of the village members who were part of the guerrilla movement. So we both of us, when we got back into the night defensive positions after one of our operations, another thing that happened that kind of turned me to was we got a new LT, and this was like the last thing that actually broke this camel's back. This guy couldn't read a map, couldn't follow a compass, got us lost. I was a platoon sergeant, and I was basically running the platoon for a couple weeks before he came in, and I just basically said, this is it, we stop right here. We're not moving any further until we figure out where the fuck we are. So we sat down, and then all of a sudden we took artillery rounds. The 9th Infantry Division was shelling us with 155 rounds. And we could hear them, and they walk them back and forth. So we could hear them walking them around us and walking them in closer and closer. We could hear the guns go off. Then we could just count the number of seconds. And the number of seconds kept getting shorter and shorter, meaning that they were coming in closer and closer. And trees that were like maybe the size of my wrist were, when they got really close, were being cut down. Like we were flat on the ground, and we were on the radio calling back, trying to figure out who was shelling us. And we had to call battalion, and the battalion had to call division, and the division had to call the MACV or wherever it was, and then they had to find out what unit, and turned out it was the 25th Infantry Unit firing support for another unit. We happened to get lost and walk into that field of fire. So that's the first time I've heard anybody in my unit actually, and I had heard this, and I always thought it was like some sort of weird cliche. Actually, I heard a couple of guys calling out for their mom. And we all thought we were goners because, literally trees were falling down on top of us, and you could hear the shrapnel whistling overhead. And that near miss with the guy in the bunker and the booby trapping of bodies, that was what pushed me over the edge. And so when we tried to get offline, of course they weren't going to let us do it because we were part of the command structure, and we didn't want to do it unless we basically had the okay from the other guys in our platoon. So we had this powwow one time when we were back in one of the NDPs. We're drinking beer and smoking dope and talking things over and bitching about the war and everything. And a couple of guys said, well, I'm here for the duration. There's no way I'm going to do anything like that. And other guys were saying yeah, I really like to do that too, but I'm afraid my family's going to disown me. I'm not going to be able to find a job, and I'm probably going to go to prison. And those three things were the three main concerns. So the platoon sniper, my first squad leader, who's another shake and bake like me, and myself, we kind of got permission from the other guys to refuse to fight. So we went to our LT and said, we're done. We're not going out anymore. He completely freaked out and sent us back to battalion. They separated the three of us immediately. And since I was a senior NCO, They told me I was going to be charged with leading a conspiracy to mutiny against the U.S. government. I didn't really think they were going to do that because there were 3 of us, and at least I was hoping they weren't going to do that because they told me it was a 20 to life sentence. And I was freaking out, but there was no way I was ever going to go back out in combat again because I was done with that shit. My first squad leader, Rich, got convinced to go back out, and Gary, the sniper, he got convinced to go back out. Gary got hit, and Rich got boils all over his body because I had a patch of ringworm that went from my elbow to my waist from the sweat. I could never get rid of it. My feet smelled like shit all the time because my feet were always wet. It was, just nasty body fungus on you everywhere. So often lots of guys would get offline just because they had bad skin diseases. So Rich ended up doing that, and Gary got hit and wounded bad enough that he ended up in Japan. And then I was on my own. And so I was brought up on charges for refusing a direct order. I had a court-martial. I defended myself. My defense was that I'd never received the direct order, which I hadn't. Nobody had actually ordered me to go to the field. And I had a panel of judges, 5 judges. There was a major or a captain, a warrant officer, and a couple of senior NCOs, E7s, E6s, E7s, E8s. I was an E5 at that time. So it wasn't really like a panel of your peers or a jury of your peers. These guys were all lifers. I wasn't. So when I defended myself, I said I was never given a direct order. It was basically a technicality. I was going to get charged one way or the other and sent to prison no matter what. So I was just, at that point, I just wanted to fuck with everybody. And I just wanted to make my point. So I just said, I was never given a direct order, so therefore these charges are invalid. So the panel of judges are allowed to cross-examine you. So when they cross-examined me, they said, well, if you had been given the direct orders, would you have refused? I said, yes, I would have refused. So then they took a break for about 5 minutes and came back and said, guilty. Stripped me of my rank, stripped me of my pay, sent me to LBJ, Long Binh Jail, in Long Binh was this huge military base, like the biggest military base in the world at that time. So there was a military prison there that was basically 3 rows of chain link with concertina wire in between and concertina wire on top, and then canvas on top of that, and everything's painted silver. So we used to call it Silver City. So I was sentenced to 6 months. I was given, there's a summary, special, and general court-martial. And I was given the special court-martial, which is in between the 2. And that can carry a maximum of 6 months. So I was given a maximum of 6 months, and then 5 months were suspended. And then I'd already been under house arrest for 2 weeks, so they just sent me there for 2 weeks. Basically what they want to do is send me to prison, scare the shit out of me, and then have me come back and send me back out to the field. So I was in Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry. They sent me to LBJ. I was there for 2 weeks. They sent me back, put me in Bravo Company. When I came back to Bravo Company, they drove me by truck out to a helipad. On the helipad, they had a pack, a helmet, an M16. They had an officer and 2 NCOs, an E6 and an E5. They snapped me to the position of attention. They had a chopper on the helipad with its rotors going. They said, pick up your gear and get on the chopper. And I said, no. They gave me the direct order. When I went, you're supposed to get a copy of your court-martial records. Somehow my first court-martial records kind of conveniently disappeared. I have a copy of my second court-martial. So when I got my second court-martial, I didn't defend myself. Who do you think volunteered to defend me in my second court-martial? My XO from Alpha Company. And he came and he basically said to me that he respected me when I was in the field and respected me for what I was doing now, and that he had volunteered to defend me because he respected me as a person. And he made the case that I had been a good soldier for 4 months and done everything that was asked of me, and that at some point I had decided that I could no longer take part in killing, and I'd become basically a CO. And he asked for clemency. And of course I got the max, got another 6 months. And then I went back to LBJ. I was back in LBJ for about 64 days. Prison was meant to hold 500. It was about meant to hold 250. There were about 500 of us there. And at the time that I did this in my company, in the battalion itself, there were about 5 of us throughout the battalion who were refusing to go on combat operations. And by 1970, the numbers had swelled even more. In fact, there were units in Vietnam. That's why Colonel Heinel wrote his article in 1971 about the collapse of the U.S. military. There were whole units that were going on strike, not quitting the war, but saying, we're going on strike today. We're not moving, we're not doing anything for a day. Guys would do things like draw peace signs in the jungle on trees. You know, the whole operation had become dysfunctional. I was in prison with one guy who was in there for getting into a Wild West gun battle on a company street, like the picture you saw of me with the tents. That was back in the base camp. That was out in the NDP. They're built up on platforms because of the monsoons. So there's a row of tents like this. Here's the company street. This is the main street. The CP is here, where the offices are, and the commanding officer. The captain's out in the field. The first sergeant, the top sergeant, is usually back in the rear. Our top wouldn't go on combat operations with it because there was a $500 reward on his head. It was rumored that if top ever went to the field and didn't come back, that there was a tree where an envelope with $500 would appear. That was common too. But one of the guys I was in prison with, in one of the company streets, with his first sergeant, with his top sergeant, they got into an argument. His top went to his tent to get his gun. He went to his tent to get his gun. They met in the street and shot it out. He shot the sergeant in the leg and was in prison for assault. And there were all kinds of things like that. The whole issue of fragging is not an urban legend. It was really true that troops would turn on some of their officers. You know, like this guy who was my second LT, the one who was new and got us lost. You know, he was thoroughly hated by everybody. Like when my first company commander heard that I had refused to fight, he was taken offline because his knees were bad. He was hardcore. He just wanted to be in combat constantly. So he was actually declared physically incapable of being in combat. So he had actually formed his own little group that went out at night on jeeps looking for trouble with a M60 on the back. And he actually sent an orderly over to get me because he thought I was refusing to fight because I didn't like the new LT. And he was trying to recruit me for his unit. And when I told him that I was actually refusing to fight, that's when he just went off on a tirade and said, you know, get out of my face. And then when I got back, came back and I was home and my dad came in, and this is like a family that, like I said, goes back to the Revolutionary War. My dad was a radio operator on a destroyer, and his destroyer was kamikaze, and he was wounded and spent some time floating in the ocean with a head wound. So he had a Purple Heart and really believed in service to country. And I was really worried about how he was going to react. Because when I graduated and got my stripes, he came to my graduation and sat in the front row very proudly as I went up and gave my salute for my stripes. And when he came in, he just walked over and shook my hand and said, "Did you do the right thing?" I said, "Yeah, I think I did." And he said, "Okay." We never talked about it ever again. And then he ended up passing away at the age of 64 because he was a smoker, and he also was in an accident in Israel. He was working with military intelligence at Wright Pat, and he was a specialist in guidance systems, missile guidance systems. And during the Israeli War of '67, they had captured a SAM missile. And the SAM missile is a two-stage missile that they were using to shoot down B-52s bombing the north. And it's one stage is solid propellant, one stage is liquid propellant. And he was taking, with an assistant, he was taking apart the guidance system. This was in Israel. He was taking apart the guidance system to analyze the guidance system, trying to figure out a way to foil these SAMs shooting down B-52s. And some Israeli techs were on the back working on one of the engines, and there was a liquid fuel spill. And the two Israeli techs, from what I understand, my mother told me this, my dad didn't tell me, they died. My dad ended up in the hospital with seared lungs, and his assistant did. And he was a heavy smoker and an alcoholic, and ended up dying from heart failure because of emphysema when he was 64. He's another person who I always thought was, a victim of the war, the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I never had a chance to really tell him my full story.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather, his father, disowned me, just like some of my troops were worried about. He refused to speak to me, and then when he was dying and living in Florida, I wanted to go see him because I spent a lot of my summers with him in Winchester, Ohio. And he was a postmaster, and I'd go sit in the post office and stamp letters for him. And, he was somebody I idolized. He had a tattooed ship here from his World War I adventures. And, I used to stare at those tattoos. And as he got older, they would start to sag and, wrinkle and get disfigured. But I always thought those things were the greatest things. And, my dad said he doesn't want to see him. So he took that to his grave. And my troops were right. Part of my family did disown me. But in retrospect, when I think back on it, it's actually helped me in the long run, because I do feel like I did the right thing. And I do feel like if I had gone through with all of that, I would be forever, I feel guilty enough about it now. And that's why I made 6 trips back to Vietnam to find out what the other side was about. And I've made a lot of friends with combat soldiers who fought against the U.S., both in the North Vietnamese Army and in the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front in the South. And they're people just like me, like Westmoreland was wrong when he said they had no feelings. They loved their families just as much, if not more, than we did. And that's what they were fighting for, freedom for their country. And now, if I hadn't done what I did, it would be harder to come to terms with the time that I was a combatant. So and it was the right thing to do. And
I think your dad saw fanatical orders followed in the kamikazes, so he understood sometimes you disobey orders.
yeah, I
don't think your grandfather ever saw that.
No, he didn't. And actually, my grandfather never saw combat.
Yeah.
He was American Navy, and I don't think he ever got out of the Caribbean.
Yeah.
So,
well, I can understand why your father.
Yeah.
He'd seen suicide bombers and whatnot,
Yeah.
so he knew those guys were just following orders too. So sometimes orders.
Yeah, you're probably right. I hadn't thought about that, but I think you're probably right.
Yeah, it's combat's not right or wrong. It's just who lives and dies.
Yeah.
People who've been in it understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you start thinking about it too much, then you get in trouble.
Yeah,
and,
you can overthink it.
And that's what I did. And I think you do at a point where I think part of being a patriot, part of patriotism, is supporting this country in a way that you think is the right path. And if you think that your country is on the right path and you're going the wrong direction. I think it's important for you as a patriot in this country to speak out. And you may find people who disagree with you, but that's what the First Amendment is about. And being able to speak out and truly believe that what you're doing is right for your country is what really patriotism is for me.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about going back to Vietnam.
You know, I got out in September of '69, and then in 1989, 1986, we started working on this project of. Do you need to change the battery on that?
Oh, you keep going.
Okay. 1986, we started working on this project about soldiers who had done some sort of anti-war activity while they were serving in the military. And I met a guy who was a combat engineer in Vietnam named David Thomas, who was putting together an organization called the Indochina Arts Project that was being somewhat funded by the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And I became a associate project director for that. And the idea is that we both wanted to find reconciliation, and we both wanted, the U.S. still had a trade embargo against Vietnam, and we wanted the U.S. to end the trade embargo and try to renegotiate a new relationship with Vietnam. So him being an artist and me being an artist, we thought the way we would do that is through cultural exchanges. So we organized an exhibition called As Seen by Both Sides, and we had 20 American artists that had done kind of anti-war artwork, and then we went to Vietnam to find 20 Vietnamese artists who were doing artwork about the war too. So we wanted this whole thing to be the subject of the war, but seen by both sides. So we wanted to have the other side to be represented. So I went on my first trip back was in 1989. Ironically, it was like exactly 20 years after I had left. And I remember when I was going to prison one time, I was riding through the countryside on a Jeep. And I remember saying to myself that, I was kind of naive and young. I just kind of, maybe a little bit idealistic. I said, one of these days I'm going to come back here and do something right. But I don't know if I ever really believed it when I said it. I just kind of said it to myself, but actually then I got the opportunity in 1989. And so we went back and worked with cultural branches of the government, the Ministry of Culture, and then with the Artists Associations of Vietnam to find Vietnamese artists. So we started interviewing all these artists that we were considering selecting for this exhibition. And in the meantime, I got to know people. Like one guy in particular that I got to know was this guy who was a tank commander, Le Tri Zung, who drove one of those Russian tanks, the famous scene of the tank that burst through the gates of the Imperial Palace. He was the second tank. He wasn't the first tank. He was actually said he was racing with the first tank, but his tank wasn't in as good a condition, so the other guy beat him and got the photo of bursting through the gates. But Zung was such a great delight to meet and trade stories with, and he and I became really good friends. On one of the trips, my wife and I stayed in his home. We were the first Westerners allowed to stay in a private home, so we stayed in his house in Hanoi instead of staying in a hotel. And he helped us find people to interview and those sorts of things. But the first two trips I made in '89 and '90 was to work on this As Seen by Both Sides project. And then when that wrapped up, it toured the U.S. for 3 years, and then went to Vietnam for a year and a half and toured there. And then through meeting these folks in 1990, I decided I would go back on my own. So I bankrolled my own trip. In fact, we were on a shoestring. So the first trip I made, I sent every single person I knew. I said, I'm going back to Vietnam. It's like kind of like a GoFundMe page, but before the internet. So I just mailed everybody. I said, I'm going back to Vietnam. Send donations. So I raised about $3,000 from all my friends, And then when I came back, I printed an 11 by 14 black and white photograph, and I sent every single person who donated um, funds to me a photograph. So that's how I got there the first 2 times, from that sort of GoFundMe project. And then the third time, I just bankrolled it myself because I wanted to go back as a photographer. I just found it fascinating. And so I worked with the Artists Association in Hanoi and in Saigon, and then just did street photography. And I wasn't looking to interview people and talk to people specifically, but I just wanted to meet people and, you know, photograph the country and see what it was like. And they were going through this process of coming out of a very hardcore communist system to a more kind of, not capitalist system, but more of an open system where they're allowing private ownership, and small mom and pop shops were starting to open up, and the government was releasing a little bit of control, because they realized that the re-education camps that they established after the war to force the Southern soldiers to take part in had become a complete disaster and a mistake, and it had done nothing more than continue to alienate. And they really wanted to try to figure out a way to kind of, you know, reunite. It wasn't necessarily that they forgave the Southerners for fighting against them. It was kind of like, I compare it to the Vichy French. You know the Vichy French? So I kind of like compare it to the Vichy French and the Free French. And then the Free French after World War II, and the hostility they had for the Vichy French, who were collaborators with the Nazis. And the Southern government was seen by a lot of Vietnamese as being collaborators with the U.S. and with the French occupation, with the colonial occupation. So they weren't real popular after the war. Just like, you know, a lot of Confederates weren't real popular with the Union after our Civil War. So it's, in some ways, it's understandable what happened, but it was a huge mistake. And I think they, to some extent, copped to that and realized it wasn't. So they had this whole system established in about 1986-87 called Doi Moi, which loosely translates as to the new openness. So they were allowing, you know, little mom and pop shops to open up. And when I first went to Hanoi, everybody's still wearing green fatigues and green pith hats. You know, all the civilian men. I thought everybody in Hanoi when I first got there was still in the army. Like when we landed in Hanoi at the airport, they had MiGs lining the runway, because they only had one runway that was both shared by the military and the civilian Air Force. And all these MiGs that were like vintage Vietnam planes were still landing there, 20, 30-year-old MiG-21s that was their Air Force. You know, like, you know, it's about as old as you can get. That's like the U.S. still flying F-4s. So in Hanoi at that time, the popular dress was, you know, green fatigues and the green pith helmet. And then shops started opening up and they started getting more westernized. And so by 1990, you started seeing preschools painting Mickey Mouse and the Smurfs to advertise their preschools in the school system. And you started, I remember later on, there was a bar that opened up in Saigon called Apocalypse Now. so you know, they really started embracing Western culture and allowing more of it in. And you looked everywhere. Like Pepsi didn't have any operation in Vietnam, but I saw billboards in Hanoi that were painted with Pepsi signs. And it wasn't because Pepsi was in operation there, it was because local merchants were bringing Pepsi in from the Philippines or from other parts of Southeast Asia and selling them in their restaurants. So they just wanted to advertise that we're now back, we're part of the world again. So big Pepsi billboards would show up. I have all these pictures that I took of all these people riding by in Ciclos, which are these three-wheeled pedicabs, and on bicycles with, you know, green pith helmets on, riding in front of this Pepsi sign. It's really ironic how much they loved American culture. Like there was a theater that was advertising a Michael Jackson video, mm-hmm. but it was JACSON. They forgot the K. So, you know, like, and we go into little bars and there might be a pirated video playing of, you know, an American group. So they were ready for the Americans to come back. And when I first went there in 89 and 90, they would always go up and say, "Ah, Linh So," which is Vietnamese for Russian. I would say, no, nui me, which is, I'm an American. They go, what are you doing here? You know, I didn't know you guys were back. And in fact, one time I was on a cyclo going through the streets of Saigon, and this woman, an elderly woman, came pedaling up on her bicycle, and she said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." She said, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm very well." And she said, "Oh, you speak English very good." She thought I was a Russian, and she just thought that Russians could speak English, so she's going to practice her English. And so then the cyclo driver said, "No linso, no me," and she turned bright red. She was like really embarrassed.
You're
She was
first American she'd ever
first
met.
American she met since the war. So, and that was true of a lot of trips we went on. You're like, we were the first Americans back. And the first 2 trips, like the hotels we stayed in, was like all these Eastern, like Eastern Bloc countries. The Berlin Wall was still up. Or was it up? No, I guess it was down. But there were a lot of satellite countries that were still there. A lot of Russian was still being spoken. So it was kind of a Wild West at first.
Mhm.
But the Vietnamese people were really warm and really generous, and like they would share anything and everything with you. And then the kind of level of things like oh, you're an American. Oh, we have to have some coffee, get to know each other. You say, oh, you were in the military. Oh, well, let's drink beer and talk about our experiences. You say, oh, you're in combat. We have to drink whiskey. And that would be the level. And I got shit-faced so many times with guys, and they tell me their stories. And that's when I got the idea, the stories they were telling me, I had to bring them back here so people would know those stories too.
Mhm.
Because their stories, our stories, Americans' troops' stories about their experiences in Vietnam pale compared to what those folks went through. And the kind of, like my friend Hun Phuong Dong, he fought the French, then the Japanese, then the French again, and then the Americans. So he'd been fighting for liberation since the 30s by the time I met him. He started as a young kid.
Mhm.
And we met a woman who gave birth under a B-52 raid, and a guy who helped dig the Cu Chi tunnels, and he's a photographer. He actually built a darkroom in the Cu Chi tunnels. His enlarger, rather they didn't have electricity, so his enlarger was sometimes a flashlight, sometimes candlelight. So he'd have to make really, really long exposures to make prints. He said one time he's making a print and there was bombing going nearby. And I don't know, you were in the infantry. Were you ever near bombing?
Yeah.
Near B-52s?
No.
But you know how the ground shakes. Yeah. And when the ground just kind of vibrates, even if the B-52s are off so far away that it just sounds like thunder, the ground still vibrates. So they were getting, there's bombing nearby, and he said that during the time he was making the prints, dirt was falling from the ceilings onto his photograph as he was trying to make it. And then people who just fought for years and years and years. And one guy who was left for dead, and actually his comrades thought he was dead and covered him up with leaves to hide his body, and then he regained consciousness, and then crawled to near a local village who helped heal him back. But dozens and dozens of stories of kinds of things that I felt in comparison it's almost like Americans were on vacation compared to what they went through.
No matter how thin you get the pancake, there's always 2 sides.
Yeah.
Living in America, you hear our side of the story.
Yeah. And to some extent, that's what the Vietnamese heard too. And what was really nice about going back is that we when I was in basic, we always demonized the Vietnamese. They were always gooks, slant eyes, slopes, yellow people, anything we could think of to dehumanize them. Because if you humanize them like I did, then you can't shoot them anymore. And if they're dehumanized, it's much easier to to not to be able to shoot, because you're not shooting another someone who's another human being. And for us to trade stories and get to know each other was like, it was great, as great for them as it was for me, I think, because they had their own prejudice about us. And to meet somebody like there's never that chance to have a break in combat, like sometimes during World War One, when people would cross over at Christmas time, and actually the Germans and the British would actually, sometimes even exchange gifts, like here's some coffee or something. That was the early part of the war, I guess. But it actually did happen in World War One. But there's never a chance in something like Vietnam or even Afghanistan or Iraq to take a break and, you're too busy trying to kill each other. And so not knowing that enemy is I don't know, like I think we've stumbled into a lot of wars just because we didn't take the time to really understand who it was we were fighting against, or maybe thinking we needed to fight against.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if we'd spent a little bit more time understanding who they were, we either wouldn't have gone into war, or if we actually dedicated ourselves to going to war, we would have prosecuted it better.
With that said, what message would you like to leave for future generations that will view this interview?
Well, I'm a college teacher now, and I do. I mean, it always seems like every time I talk about this, it always seems like it's the first time, even though I've talked about it a lot. And I used to think that the more you talked about it, like first 10 years I was out, I just tried to burn it out of my memory. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. Drugs and alcohol for 10 years. And then finally I got through that. And then I started making artwork about it. And then I started talking about it. And I thought it was going to be a cathartic experience, and that it'd get easier to talk about, but it doesn't. It never gets easier. But it's something that I've come to terms with and know that I have to remember, that I have to carry, and that if my story can inform somebody in the future and make them better educated about options, about knowledge of what you're getting yourself into, and going into it without blinders or without being blinded by your government or by propaganda, then that's the thing I'd want people to get from it, is to don't blindly join something, don't blindly become part of something until you really know what it is you're doing, especially if it's going to be a situation where you're going to be taking somebody else's life. And if you're going to take somebody else's life, you better damn well understand what you're doing and totally submit yourself to it and agree to it. Otherwise, don't do it. And even if your government or people around you think you should do something, it's really up to you as a person to decide what your path should be. And you have to follow your conscience. And sometimes your conscience, and in some ways, I'm not a religious person, but in some ways your responsibility to your conscience and your God is to make sure that you're doing the right thing and to follow that conscience beyond what the orders are, beyond what anyone else is saying. There were guys in My Lai who participated in that massacre because everybody was doing it. There was one chopper pilot who lowered his helicopter and trained guns on American soldiers and told them to stop. And if he hadn't done that, more civilians, more innocent civilians would have been killed over those 3 days that the My Lai massacre happened. But it took one guy and one gun crew on one helicopter to say no when officers and the command structure on the ground was saying kill, kill, kill. So you got to follow your conscience. I mean, it's just like, that's what the Nuremberg trials were about. The Nazi soldiers said, I was only following orders. the people who ran the concentration camps and sent Jews to the ovens, I was only following orders. But at some point, you have to stand up. At some point, you have to stand up and just say no.
Do you have anything else?
I don't think so. It's a
Well, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Sure.
All right. Well, that concludes the interview of William Ralph Short. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. US 51882341.